For more on today's closing arguments and the testimony that we've heard over the last few weeks, we bring in Lisa Houlé. She's former LA County prosecutor and a defense attorney who's worked with and defended hundreds of police officers. Thanks so much for joining us again, Ms. Houlé. So the prosecution says that this case is about one man, Derek Chauvin, and not about the Minneapolis Police Department. Let's take a listen.
And what the defendant did here was a straight-up felony assault. This was not policing. That force for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that killed George Floyd. He betrayed the badge and everything it stood for. It's not how they're trained. It's not following the rules. This is not an anti-police prosecution. It's a pro-police prosecution.
How well do you feel that the state argued this point, and what was the strategy behind it?
Linsey, I think they argued this point so well. This is about one man. This is not about the entire Minneapolis Police Department. And they really do need to stand behind the good guys, right? The ones who are there to protect and serve, the ones who are there to investigate crimes, the ones who are there to lawfully apprehend people and arrest people that need to be taken to jail. Officer Chauvin is not one of those officers. He used unreasonable force, and he really disparaged, the badge and all the other good officers that he works with. So that was a very important distinction to make.
You so often work with police officers. Do you get a sense of how many in law enforcement are feeling about this trial? And whatever the verdict may be, do you think that this landmark case will have an ultimate impact on policing in America?
I absolutely get a very strong feeling from other officers about how they feel about this. And it is abundantly clear that there isn't one officer that I've spoken to who thinks that this was a reasonable use of force. They are all really just so disappointed, to put it mildly, with what Officer Chauvin did. And remember, I have very close relationships with clients, former officers that I used to work with as a prosecutor. So I know hundreds, if not thousands of law enforcement officers. And this is from chiefs, former chiefs, captains, all the way down to the boots on the ground. And I have yet to talk to one person who will say that they think that what Officer Chauvin did was okay. And I really do think it's going to change the way, we look at policing moving forward. I absolutely do.
In the defense's closing argument, we heard a lot about what a so-called reasonable police officer would do. Here's just one of those moments.
A reasonable officer wants to keep his fellow officers safe. A reasonable police officer takes into consideration the safety of civilians. The reasonable police officer takes into account the safety of the person that they are arresting.
From all of the evidence that we heard, do you think that Derek Chauvin acted like a so-called reasonable police officer in this situation? And do you think that repeating that phrase so many times offered some help for the defense?
I think that is honestly going to backfire. And here's why I say that. First of all, that was maybe, a shot of Mr. Nelson saying that term 3 times. He must have said it over 100 times in his closing argument. And the reason it's going to backfire is Officer Chauvin didn't use the reasonable care. He didn't operate as a reasonable police officer. He wasn't making sure that Mr. Floyd was okay. He was dismissive. He almost was mocking. He didn't seem to care. He showed complete callous disregard while engaged in an imminently dangerous act of basically cutting off air. Remember, cutting off somebody's air, that's a precursor to death. So this was absolutely not reasonable at all. And I think it's going to backfire.
And lastly, taking a step back here, which side do you feel that made a better closing argument today, the prosecution or the defense? And do you think that it'll take a long time for the jury to reach its decision?
So I think the prosecutors in this case did an excellent job. But I also do want to say something about Mr. Nelson. So Mr. Nelson is a good lawyer, and he really did a good job with the proverbial, hand that he was dealt. And I say that with appreciation and empathy for the very, very difficult job that he has to do. But again, I think that the prosecution just really knocked it out of the park. They were professional. They were not overly emotional or dramatic. They made their points well. They were articulate. They pointed out that, look, this is not a difficult issue. Number one, the force was unreasonable. Number two, Officer Chauvin's knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, cutting off his air, that was a substantial cause of death. And even despite all the medical issues and pre-existing conditions that Mr. Floyd had, those are not defenses to any of these charges. And as Mr. Blackwell so eloquently said, even the 9-year-old could see that this was wrong. And just like the rest of the world can see that this was wrong. So I really think the prosecution did an excellent job.
Do you think that it's just going to be a matter of time before we get the verdict, a short amount of time, I should say?
I wouldn't be surprised if we got it in a short amount of time. However, keep in mind, these jurors, this is the first time they're hearing all this. They are not legal experts. They need to take the care and the time to arrive at a verdict that they believe in and that they feel confident in. So while to people like, you and I, we may think that this should be a no-brainer, it still might take some time. But I do ultimately think Officer Chauvin is going to be convicted. I don't see any other outcome.
Lisa Houlé, we thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks, Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.